Welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm Laura Reckford, Executive Director of Falmouth Art Center. We have a great group here tonight, and we're so excited about tonight's program with Murray Whyte, art critic for the Boston Globe. But a few housekeeping matters. We are recording tonight's session because there were several people who wanted to come but couldn't make it at the last minute. And so we do have the recording going on Zoom. So I do have some tips. Most of us have been practically living on Zoom for the past year, but for those of you who don't live on Zoom, and you're very lucky, I'm going to give you some tips about Zoom. The mute button. The mute button is a picture of a little microphone. It's usually in the bottom left. Sometimes it's in the top right or top left, depending on your device. You'll want to keep yourself on mute unless you want to ask a question. Turns out the microphones on these devices are very sensitive. So if you're not muted, we might hear your dog bark or your spouse ask where dinner is, your phone ring, things like that. So if we do start hearing things in your household that we shouldn't be hearing, we will go ahead and mute you. But if you want to keep yourself on mute unless you're asking a question, that would be helpful. If you want to be seen on the screen, you simply click the little video camera next to the mute button. If you don't want to be on camera, you can click that button and you see the little red line goes across it, and that means we don't see you. Same with the mute button, that little red line across it means that you're on mute. And you have two different views that are sort of on a toggle, speaker view and gallery view, which are usually in the upper left or the upper right, depending on your device. Gallery view is what we call the Brady Bunch view. That's where you see everyone who is here on the meeting in equal size boxes. Speaker view puts the speaker in a big box and everyone else is in small boxes. And you might want to use gallery view at the beginning to see who's here. And then when the speaker starts up, you might want to switch to speaker view. I will also spotlight the speaker when Murray starts speaking, so that will take over the big screen, and he will be doing a shared screen, and so that also takes up the big screen. During the shared screen, if you want to minimize the little, you'll see a couple little boxes. If you want to minimize those, you can do that by clicking on the horizontal line in the upper left-hand corner of those little boxes. And you can also move those little boxes around if you feel that they're in the way of the PowerPoint. We will be doing a question and answer session at the end of the talk. If you have a question during the talk, you can put it in the chat so you don't forget it. And then we may insert those questions into the talk if it seems a particularly pertinent thing, but mostly we'll be doing the questions at the end. And when we get to the Q&A, you're welcome to ask your questions, take yourself off mute and ask them, or you can put it in the chat if you'd rather do that. So that's it for what we call the rules of the sandbox for Zoom. And now to some things about You Art What You Eat. So this is the 11th year of our spring fundraiser, You Art What You Eat. And as many of you know, the event usually takes place in person at local restaurants, and we've reinvented it for the pandemic era. We have 4 terrific speakers over the next month. Many of you have signed up for all 4 lectures, and thank you for that. Next week on Wednesday, April 14th, we have Carol Skolins, and she's an art history professor at UMass Boston, and she'll be talking about American modernism in New England, taking us starting in the 19th century and touching on various art colonies all the way through to the 1960s in Provincetown. And then the following week, we have a very interesting talk. We have on Tuesday, April 20th, Elaine King, a prominent art historian, will speak on spirituality in contemporary art. And then last but not least, we have Jay Critchley, a Provincetown artist known for his provocative installations, and he'll speak about his current project called Democracy of the Land, Mobile Warming. And with that talk, Jay will also install here at the Art Center property, he'll install his banner depicting the Mayflower Compact with images of women replacing the images of men. So that will be an interesting installation that he'll do here during the 2 weeks or so around his talk. So each night of the art talk is paired with a restaurant, one of our local restaurants, just to support our local restaurants who are struggling. And I know we will all enjoy our dinners from Blue in Mashpee tonight. I've heard from people already that they really enjoyed their meal, those who got into it already, and I'm looking forward to getting into mine a little later. We also have a special treat for all of you who signed up. We have gift bags here at the Art Center containing a piece of pottery and a weaving made by local artists. So please stop by and pick up your gift bag if you haven't already. We also want to thank our sponsors, Karen and John Burton from Sotheby's Realty, who have made this whole event possible. And a brief plug about the Falmouth Art Center. We are free and open to the public daily. We have 3 new exhibits every month. Right now we have Splash of Color with more than 90 pieces by 67 local artists. Lots of different mediums are represented in that show. It's a beautiful show. In another gallery, we have Portraits and Figures by Diana Lee, Ruth Leach, Peg Wilson, and Kathy Vanderbilt. And we have the show called Inspired by Sudoku, where our fiber artists have made weavings inspired by that popular math puzzle. Well, some of you may like it, some of you don't like it, but they're inspired by that puzzle. And we do have virtual art receptions every month. The next one is next Monday, where artists who have work in those exhibits will speak about their work. And so some of you have been faithfully going to those, and that will be a lot of fun. Our classes are now on Zoom and in person, and our summer vacation camps for kids quickly filling up. And you can check all of the activities out on our website for everything going on. And now to tonight's program. I have been an avid reader of the Boston Globe's art critic Murray Whyte, and I am really pleased that he was available to speak with us tonight about Edward Mitchell Bannister, a 19th century artist who is also a cultural leader in Providence, Rhode Island. Murray Whyte is an award-winning journalist. Previously, he was at the Toronto Star, the largest daily newspaper in Canada, where he had been a feature writer, cultural journalist, and critic. He has been published in the New York Times, The Guardian in the UK, the Times of London, the New York Observer, Esquire magazine, and Details magazine, among others. He is a National Newspaper Award winner, Canada's highest journalism honor, a journalism fellow at the University of Toronto, the winner of the Journalism Fellowship at the Asian Pacific Federation of Canada, which sponsored a reporting project in China, among other fellowships. He has been a television documentary producer for the Canadian Public Broadcasting Corp and deputy arts editor for the Seattle Times. And without further ado, I welcome Murray Whyte.
Wow, is it my turn now? What's left to be said? That was a long credit roll. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. It just makes me feel old more than anything. But so I'm obviously here to speak about Edward Mitchell Bannister, who, I kind of want to start by saying that I knew very, very little about before really just a few months ago. And I think that's, there's certainly, it's neither my fault nor anybody else's, but for the fact of kind of I think the social dynamic that caused Banister to become not forgotten, certainly, but pushed to the sideline in sort of the greater American art historical narrative. The way that I kind of found my way to Banister, somebody who I knew peripherally, was that over the course of the pandemic, starting a year ago, as of mid-March, every museum in the country had been shut down. That's typically where I spend all my time. So everybody was thinking, what are we going to do? I mean, not only what are we going to do in terms of sort of staying safe, but how are we going to continue to bring content that's not just sort of like doom and gloom and disaster, and how can we still sort of interact with the cultural life of our country and our city when all these venues that we're used to, that we depend on for this kind of content, are closed. So I had come up with an idea kind of in a panic late at night that I would do a series called Pilgrimages, which would take me really all over the region, going to places where significant artists or significant works had been made, where they practiced, and what I could do to sort of get out of that kind of white cube painting on white wall kind of experience, and try to stand in their shoes and see sort of what I could see that was different. I'm going to excuse myself for a moment because my daughter's being very loud upstairs. Una, I'm on a Zoom meeting. I'm sure you can all sympathize with that. So pilgrimages began a year ago. I did it for almost 8 months before things started to open again, and we started to behave somewhat more normally. But it was a really popular series. I don't think I'd ever gotten more email from readers than I did over the course of doing that. You know, I covered everything from, you know, Helen Frankenthaler in Provincetown to Thomas Cole in New Hampshire. I mean, it spanned really the entire sort of gamut of New England art experiences. And, you know, as part of this, obviously we wanted to, I mean, I started feeling a real compulsion to sort of broaden that frame, to try and talk about figures that maybe weren't famous to history, but were somewhat lost to history. So when I came back around to the series again earlier this winter, somebody who had always kind of been like in my long list of people to explore was Banister. And I knew that I knew not a lot about him, but I knew that he had, you know, been a significant figure in Providence and, you know, had been seen sort of as a regional painter in many ways, important to the founding of their art club there. So I just started to spend a little bit more time thinking about him. And really, I wrote quite a long piece about sort of what I had learned about him, and I spent some time trying to you know, retrace his steps. And as you'll see, that's harder than it sounds. But you know, it was surprising to me how little I could find out about him. I mean, I could certainly track his sort of life on a timeline, but there wasn't a lot of sort of deep thought about what his artistic contribution and development was about. Until I happened upon a very, very recent PhD thesis by a young woman whose name I'm going to mention here, because if you're interested in him, this is essential reading, and it will tell you far more than I can. And I'd be happy to post it later. Her name is Tracy Lee Costa at Roger Williams University. And she really sort of, one of the few kind of academic theses about Banister, not just sort of his as a figure in history, but as an artist with a really sort of deep philosophical mode of working. So, you know, I became completely entranced by this artist, and you know, I finished what I had written by saying that it's really way past time for there to be some acknowledgement that, you know, some of the works that he made over the course of his life should be considered true American masterpieces. So we'll get there, but we'll start somewhere else first. So I don't know how familiar any of you are, so I don't want to bore you necessarily with timeline, but I think that his story is a very interesting one. And I will begin at this point with my handy slideshow. Okay, so this is a picture of Banister later in his life. I guess he was probably, he was born in 1828, as you can see, died in 1901. He was well into his 70s at this point. He was a very established figure in Providence, but again, had never really sort of achieved national acclaim. Interesting figure just in terms of sort of that time period in the United States. He was born in New Brunswick in Canada, which holds a place in my heart because I'm also Canadian. But he had a very different experience than many Black people in North America at that time, and that New Brunswick had abolished slavery by the time he was a child. And even though his mother died when he was quite young, but he was in effect adopted by a wealthy white family in Canada, and had full access to, you know, a very high level of education, and really a lot of the advantages that his peers, obviously south of the border, were yet to even begin to imagine. So we had Banister, who was, you know, St. Andrews now is a tiny place. Then it was even tinier. So he was a rural, well-educated Black man in Canada, which, you know, was obviously a very rare person. He and his brother, who had benefited from the same upbringing, I guess as young men do, were sort of in the spirit of seeking adventure, decided they would move to Boston when they were in their 20s. So in the I guess maybe when they were teenagers in the late 1840s. So they moved to Boston. And they worked on the various merchant ships, and were these kind of, again, rare figures. They were free Black men in New England who had never known or touched or had any sort of experience of slavery. So they had a very different kind of approach to their lives there. I mean, obviously they were slaves were doing what they could to escape the South, and many of them were ending up in New England. Many of them were continuing on to Canada, but they had come the other way as free men, seeking their fortune in many ways. So I just wanted to, the next thing that I wanted to talk about, I'll come back to him, but I mean, it's interesting to think about what Boston looked like. This is around the time that he arrived in 1850. It was an incredibly bustling, people like to describe it as a European village. And this is a man who was there to find his fortune. It was a place with vast fortunes that had been built, many of them through the slave trade, through triangular trade. And yet here was Banister with aspirations of being far more than a menial worker. So he had learned about sort of 18th century French and British art while a student in Canada. So he had brought that knowledge with him to Boston with the intention of working in illustration, or something along those lines. I mean, I don't think that as a young man he had quite sort of figured out whether or not he was going to be a significant painter or a painter at all. But I mean, that was something that he had always been drawn to, even as a young man. So he arrived in Boston to find it a bustling, busy place that, was perhaps not as welcoming to somebody who saw himself as free as he did, and immediately kind of found himself drawn into what could be, I think, quite fairly described as an activist community there. He met his wife, who is, here we are, Christiana Carto Banister. She was running a hair salon, and he began working for her. And she was also a very active abolitionist. So the two of them were actually very, very active in the activist community. And Banister, particularly in using his skills as an artist, was kind of finding his way into that community using the skills that he had. This is a painting of her by him, by the way, shortly after they met. He was using his skills as an artist to try and broadcast the importance of prominent Black figures in the Boston community. Some of them were commissioned, some of them he did on his own. He had done a painting of a Dr. John V. DeGrasse, who was the city's first Black doctor. That, as is a common theme, unfortunately, with his work, has been lost. Nobody knows what happened to it. He and Carto were very active in raising money for a petition for equal pay for Black soldiers in the Union Army. There was, I mean, we don't have to look very far to sort of look to this incredible piece that is under repair right now, but sits on the common as it does. He did a very large scale portrait of Robert Gould Shaw himself that was actually well enough regarded by government officials at the time that it hung in the State House for a while. But again, like many of his works, is now lost to history. So Boston was not that kind to Banister and Carto. She was actually an Indigenous person. She was Narragansett, and she had come from Rhode Island. So together in the late 1860s, they decided that they would move to Rhode Island. And I think it's a really interesting sort of thing to consider what was going on in the country at that time. I mean, their time in Boston together was spent, in the lead up to the Civil War, through the Civil War, and then sort of wound down in the sort of early moments of Reconstruction. So you had, I mean, I wanted to share this picture because, the contrast, it was very rapid. The contrast from the Boston he arrived in and the Boston he left from, I actually should say 1870, was rapid. I mean, the onset of what we now think of as what we would now call modernity was all around them. It was affecting everything from sort of the social order to the way that the city was arranged, certainly to the cultural world and painting and art. So this was a moment of intense upheaval that I think left a lot of people behind, and they made the decision to remove themselves from it and retreat to Providence, where they could be surrounded by family. Now, Banister, throughout this tumultuous time, as a Black man who was agitating for freedom and equal rights, was still working on his painting, still, had every intention of leading a life as some kind of artist, was kind of following along behind one of the most, perhaps the most significant American art movement of the 19th century, which is the Hudson River School. And I just pulled this Thomas Cole painting just as an illustration because it's so emblematic, I think, of what that school is about. It's, I mean, I don't mind saying I'm not a fan. It's grandiose. I mean, it is just, it's so far beyond kind of what our experience of nature would actually be. And it is in the way that it ties into things like manifest destiny and kind of this notion of empire building, I think is really significant because, you have it tied to the spiritual framework, this notion of American empire, this notion of, being God's chosen ones, all kind of comes crashing down for me in this painting. And it really is the sort of almost overwhelmingly treacly treatment of a land that doesn't really exist in that way. So this is kind of it's really kind of taking British Romanticism and turning it up to 11. And it goes quite a bit too far for me. And in many ways, this is where modernism is born, as a counter-reactive to that. So Banister would have been in a position where he was surrounded by this. This would have been the popular art of his day. And the easy thing for somebody of his skill, and he did have great skill, would have been to follow in those footsteps. Instead, he did works like this. And I think one of the things that you'll find with Banister is, one of the things that's very hard to sort of understand about the arc of Banister's career is that many of his works are untitled, many of them are undated, nobody knows where they are, and yet they have this, this really sort of like strong aesthetic that is, ultimately a rejection, I think, of everything that this is. I mean, he's working from a quite literally a ground level place. He's capturing sort of density and darkness. And I think that the thing that's important to remember is this is not realism. He is working through a spiritual framework as well, but it's a very different one than his immediate predecessors were working from. So I just assembled a few paintings kind of this ilk, where once again, I mean, he didn't call that cloudy sky, somebody did at some point, but he wasn't interested. And this is why I say, like, you really see the first sort of glimmers of modernism in his work, in that he didn't title things. I mean, he wasn't interested in the specificity of place. If we just jump back to Cole for a second, it is the Oxbow view from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts, after a rainstorm. You cannot be any more specific about what's being painted than that. Whereas Banister was not interested in the specificity of place. He was interested in evoking emotion or seen in a more general way, but certainly sort of like some kind of spiritual conduit to the sublime that was not tied to particularity. And I think that they're just, I mean, this is likely just a sketch, but I mean, I just think the way that the light works in it is extraordinary. I mean, it's one of those situations, quite in contrast with what had immediately come before, where he's just doing so much with ultimately so little, which is one of the things I've come to really appreciate about him. I mean, this is there's nothing grand about his work. I mean, this is a woman carrying a log in this extraordinarily sort of blown out autumnal glade. And I just find it captivating. I mean, that sky it almost feels like it's actually sort of lit from behind in some ways. It's so extraordinary. I pulled this one because, again, this is getting sort of later on in his career, and you can sort of see that he's much more confident with his brush. He's almost impressionistic at this point. You can see sort of those elements, I think, of gestural brushwork starting to make their way into his work. And there's a reason for that. I mean, Banister, again, was because of his background, because he was not American, because he did not experience slavery, because he had access to education. He had actually had access to being able to study European painting at a fairly young age, and really throughout his life. And it's something that sort of sustained him. So there was really an awareness throughout his career of what the antecedents were that he was most interested in. I just pulled this one up because he doesn't, I mean, you'll see he's very sort of very much about the landscape, and very much about sort of a non-heroic, almost sort of like immersion in the landscape. There is no sort of distance between you and the landscape. It's really about sort of being surrounded by it. But I do love his figures, and I do love how sort of indistinct they tend to be in a lot of ways. And again, this is just a sketch, but it's one that you can find it on the Smithsonian website. It just struck me as this sort of like remarkable piece where so much is happening with so little. I mean, you can almost count the brush strokes in a way, and yet the scene is so evocative. Now I brought this out for a couple of reasons. Again, I mentioned that Banister was very schooled in European painting, and not only was he did he have a background in it, but he followed it throughout his life, and he knew what he liked. He was not easily influenced, and he chose those sort of lines that he wanted to pursue. So I've picked this one specifically so we can look at the next one. But I just wanted, as a side note, I wanted to say that he was never known to have painted. He was never known to have painted a self-portrait, but there is some thought that the man in the red shirt might in fact be him. At least that's the suggestion. So Jean-François Millet, who is obviously one of the sort of major figures of the Barbizon school, was somebody that Banister looked to a lot. Somebody he really had a great deal of respect for. And I think if you don't necessarily see it in the actual technique. I mean, I feel like you do, but I mean, just the positioning of the figures, kind of the very kind of quotidian workaday scene that you're looking at. I mean, again, nothing grand, nothing sort of homage, like it really is sort of about the virtue of the everyday. And that's something that he certainly took from the Barbizon, I think. This will be something that is probably familiar to most of you, and if it's not, or if it is rather, I'll apologize that I don't know why my computer cropped the top of the frame, but it's looking at it this way is just driving me crazy because there's at least a few more inches top and bottom, and that's certainly not the way Millet painted it. But anyways, I apologize. But I just wanted to pull this one up because again, it's that sort of workaday scene, that everyday scene, that there's nothing grand about it. But I think when you're looking at Banister and you're looking at sort of the tones that he creates and the skies and sort of the way the landscape kind of in many ways swallows you, or certainly the figures are not. The figures don't stand out from the landscape. They're seen as part of the landscape. There's this kind of unity to the picture that I feel like Banister always really had as a major priority. I don't want to talk about this painting just yet. I just want to go back a little bit and talk a little bit more about his life. So he was very motivated. Again, as I said, when he first moved to Boston, he knew he had a certain amount of skill. He was interested in art. He was a young man. He was trying to find his way. But the legend goes with Banister that he kind of, the tipping point for him when he decided, I will be a professional artist, I will make my living as an artist, I will show them, came in 1967 when he was reading in the New York Herald a piece by the critic of the day.
1867.
Yeah. What did I say?
You said 1918.
Definitely not 1967. No. In 1867, he was reading a piece by the critic in the New York Herald, and I think you have to remember sort of the moment. It was just a scant few years after emancipation, the Civil War, and so there was a great influx of former slaves to the north, and the cities were becoming much more cosmopolitan places, whether those who had inhabited them prior liked it or not. And so in the paper, I assume to sort of put down the aspirations of certain Black artists, the critic wrote that, and I'm quoting, "The Negro seems to have an appreciation for art while being manifestly unable to produce it." So that got Banister very riled up. And there was essentially that in that moment, he said, well, to hell with it. I will show you I can do more than appreciate art. I'll show you that I can also be an artist of very high standing. And it didn't take him long to prove himself right for the whole world to see. He entered a piece in the Philadelphia Exposition in 1876 and took first prize. His piece took first prize. Nobody knew he was Black. It was entered anonymously. The painting was called Under the Oaks, and it was a unanimous first prize win. Immediately when he came in person to claim it and they saw that he was Black, they tried to nullify the win. But certain members of the jury stood up for him and allowed him to have it. And I think this is another example of, the way that these things, the way that unfortunately history has unfolded around certain artists who have been marginalized. That piece that was so sort of instrumental, certainly in his personal history, and was ultimately, a very important painting in that exhibition, has also been lost. It's not known to exist anywhere anymore. So that's, which is, again, kind of a shocking thing. Now, Approaching Storm, we'll get to this particular painting in a minute, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about when Bannister came to Providence after leaving Boston. He had this sort of epiphany that he was, he would pursue art. He would show the world that they were wrong. And this is all sort of happening as he's leaving Boston, arriving in Providence, and really kind of devoted himself to that pursuit. He, again, quite surprisingly for his times, he became a real cultural leader in that city. He was actually the founder of the Providence Art Club, which still exists today, and actually is one of the few places you can see his work permanently on display. So if you have a chance to get there, the last time I was there was in February, and they were still closed for the pandemic. So I'm not sure what their status is right now. But in this world where so few Banisters are hanging on walls, anywhere you can see them, it is really one of those few places. So he became a real builder of that city as a cultural center, which I think arguably could be said it was not before his arrival and before his activism. There's a split in belief as to whether or not he was on one of the founding board members of the Rhode Island School of Design. Some sources say yes, some sources say no. Their archivists aren't sure. I've talked to them about it, but nonetheless, there's no question that he was important to that city. There's his home in Providence is now owned by Brown University, and it's been restored, and it's I wouldn't call it a shrine to Banister, but it's certainly a memorial to him, and it's used as visiting faculty housing now for the art department. So Banister has some presence in his hometown, although not in many other places in the United States, unfortunately. So again, I had started by mentioning that I would certainly not call myself expert in Banister, other than sort of as a sudden new fan who has wanted to learn as much as I possibly could, but was very sort of drawn to this very in-depth thesis written by Tracy Lee Costa that was really important for me in learning more and being able to write about him in a coherent manner. And I think that one of the things that Costa did that was so important about, at least for me, in establishing this notion that isn't Banister, going beyond the notion that isn't Banister's story amazing, because it is quite an amazing story. But I mean, let's not talk about him as an amazing story. Let's talk about him as an accomplished painter worthy of our respect and attention, and ultimately the elevation of what he accomplished in his career. So what Tracy does with just really terrific eloquence is establishes Banister's philosophical framework through these pictures, using evidence and kind of talking about the things that he was interested in and wrote about over the time of his career. He was a thoroughly educated, aware, philosophical painter. He was very, as I mentioned, he was in tune with kind of the early strains of modernism, as you would see in Millet, that sort of like de-heroicizing of the landscape, that acknowledgement of massive change as agrarian lifestyle started to give way to urban lifestyle, and the notion of peasants and gleaners and all these kinds of things as cities began to take hold of our imagination, leaving people in the rural spaces as those without. So he was in tune. He was very much in tune with sort of the social upheavals of his day, but he was also in tune with the philosophical and spiritual upheavals of his day too. He was a real adherent to a movement called German Transcendental Idealism, which sounds like a mouthful, but fundamentally he was one of the few artists, I think, in this country who kind of took together the sort of nature-driven spiritual philosophies of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Washington Allston and that group, and kind of merged them with the European thinking of the day. So you have this situation, I think, where Banister is trying to say something much larger about the world through his work than very simple ideas of God in nature, or you know, man's conquest of nature. It's a much more sophisticated frame, I think, than that. Approaching Storm is a really interesting one to look at because it's very easy to look at it as, you know, this figure sort of striding into the woods, and you know, this is man sort of making his bargain with nature, and ultimately that bargain will be won, and they'll live in something that looks like harmony. And I don't know if that's true. I mean, there's a really sort of, there's a compelling argument, I think, to be made that, you know, you look at this person who is fundamentally under threat, and we put it in the context of, you know, advancing modernity. You have somebody with an axe going into an unforgiving place that has, I mean, I just look at this picture as a departure into the unknown. You see the darkness on the left side of the sky, and you know, this unforgiving sort of space where anything could happen. Ultimately, the outcome is yet to be known, and ultimately it's a gesture of faith. And I think that that's a really interesting way to look at this painting. If there's one painting I think that people most often look to of Banister's, if there's one that's very famous, it's called The Hay Gatherers. And you're looking at it now. This is one of the very rare times that Banister actually painted Black figures, which you'll see on the sort of lower right-hand side of the frame. And I have to give all credit to Tracy for these observations, because she was really the one who sort of allowed me to see what was happening here. And again, there's a very simple way to look at this picture, was of Banister as a Black man painting what might be considered a sympathetic image of Black farm laborers, you know, presumably under sort of a beating sun and working in difficult conditions. I want to quote Tracy here, because I think she makes a really interesting observation. She said that the whole entirety of Banister's work provided to him a space to synthesize the disparity between the ideal existence and lived reality. So for an idealist painter, which is what Banister was, realism wasn't really a way to express the profound rift between what was said and what was done, what existed and what could be. I mean, this is a time where, you know, slavery had been abolished, but Black Americans hadn't escaped the daily rights of discrimination and condescension. I mean, ultimately, this is a people that's fundamentally lost between houses in many ways. And this is something that Tracy sort of helped me to understand, is if you look less at what's in the picture, what's literally in the picture, than what the picture is, if you know what I mean. It tells you a lot. I mean, it's a very claustrophobic composition. I mean, what you have, I think, is you have these two layers of tree and suppressive sky, and you really have no way to see the horizon. You don't know, you can't, there's no suggestion that there is a future. And if there is one, it's far beyond your sight. So to me, I mean, sort of looking at this picture just sort of brings home in a very sort of like resonant emotional way the fact of, I think, what he was painting, and that's what makes it a great painting. And I feel much more comfortable writing about this than trying to talk about it. But I think a very strong case could be made for this as you know, really an American masterpiece that deserves its proper place among that kind of canon. So, you know, I've done this publicly before, but I mean, I do think that it's time, you know, for Banister to be considered that way by one of our great museums. And I would certainly, you know, I've had conversations with the Boston MFA about exactly that. I mean, I say conversations, I've suggested it, they haven't really gotten back to me. But I do think there's nothing to advocacy here. I think it's a fairly easy thing to do, you know, not only given the context of today, but I mean, this is a very holistic view I think we can take about Banister as a thoroughly accomplished painter whose achievements were cast aside because of who he was in his day. And these are exactly the kinds of things that we have to start looking past in a more serious way, and to understand the many things that we probably have lost in our culture because we have been trained to look away from them for reasons that make no sense. So that is mostly what I have to say. So I hope that was interesting, and I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Great. That was wonderful, Murray. Thank you. Lots to think over. We have one question that came in just now about the size of the paintings. How large are
Oh,
these paintings?
That's a good question. He did not paint a very large scale. I mean, let me look really quickly here. I can tell you exactly how big some of these were. I mean, the more sketch-like pieces that I had shown you, we're talking about sort of like 8 by 10, 9 by 12. Hay gatherers in particular, let me just look that up quickly for you. I mean, at most, maybe I'm just looking at one of the landscape paintings, fairly typical size for its day. It was 36 by 50. So a reasonable size, but by no means a massive scale work.
Very good. And this is the time to ask questions, folks. I'm going to remove the spotlight so I can see everyone in case people want to raise their hand, but you can just blurt a question out, or here's another one in the chat. Feel free to put them in the chat. Amy asks, where can you see his work? I think you were saying that there aren't too many places, but
yeah, well, I mean, this is the bulk of his known work is at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. And let me just I can tell you exactly how that got there. So for a long time, RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, had a lot of his work for a long time. It was, donated by family or left by him, and generally not much was done with it. I mean, the Providence Art Club does, again, that is one of the only places in the country where you can sort of see his work at all times. They don't have a large collection, but they have a number of paintings, and they'll have a few on display that they rotate in and out over time, because as an homage to obviously the person who founded the place. But long ago, his family donated about 100 pieces to RISD, and then RISD gave them to the Frederick Douglass Institute in the 1960s, which then merged with the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. So they're all now in the Smithsonian collection. So if you want to see more, and if you like, let me just grab the link for you here. It's a great resource to just sort of, you can browse through more than 100 of his pieces. I'll put it in the chat for you right now.
Thank you. And this is a fun comment from Carla Hutker. She says, I like the contrast of your fireplace and Eames chair.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, that's thank you. The Eames chair is the chair for my kid's piano is over there, actually, if you want to see. That's the keyboard set.
And back to Banister. Did he ever travel to Europe?
No, he never did. He never actually did travel to Europe. He lived from New Brunswick to Boston to Providence and in the region, but no, never had the means to travel.
And here's another one. Did he teach or mentor?
I don't think he never formally taught, as far as I know. He never held a position, but he was a mentor to literally dozens of artists. With the founding of the club and being involved with RISD and Brown as he was, and when he died in Providence, I mean, I love that he died in 1901. I love the fact that he made it to the 20th century in many ways. I just feel like that's important. But by the time of his death, he had mentored dozens, if not hundreds, of aspiring artists, and really he was a real community builder, I think, ultimately is what it comes down to. Somebody who provided space for artists of all kinds to believe that they could be artists. And he was living proof. He had, through sort of simple determination and obvious skill, but with a lot of determination through significant barriers, had crafted a career for himself.
And another one, are the pilgrimages available to see anywhere?
Yeah, they're on the site. They're on our site. I don't know if let me have a quick look. They're not, I don't think they're collected as like a vertical of all pilgrimages, but if you look under my name, it shows you everything I've done. And most of them have a label. Let me just see if I can get that for you.
Karen fills in there too, but they're not showing.
Would you like me to post the link to the one about Banister in particular?
Sure. I think that would be helpful for people.
Sure. I can also post, as I say, I mean, it's if you're intrigued by the Banister story, and like ultimately, I think, you know, much more depth than I can go into here, I do really recommend the thesis that Tracy Lee Costa wrote. It's quite remarkable, and really sort of helped me to see things in a very different way. So
Another question is, was he well known in his time?
he was well known in his community, I think is the best way to put it. You know, he was not somebody who got a lot of attention outside of his immediate sphere. It was very hard as a black man to have, unfortunately, to have a lot of the white art establishment take him seriously at all. So, you know, despite his time in Boston, and he was certainly connected to activist communities there, but I mean, there was no opportunity for him to show there. He didn't have a dealer there. He certainly never had a museum show in his lifetime there. So, I mean, between Boston and New York, there was just not really any opportunity for him. So he ultimately settled career-wise to be this kind of community leader in Providence. But I think aspirationally, you know, I don't think I'm sure he was bothered, but he didn't let sort of the fact that those doors were shut tamp down his ambitions as a painter. I think he's a very ambitious painter.
And here's another question. How did he show his work?
It's hard for me to say. I don't know, but again, it was very limited venues in Providence. I mean, he was beloved at the art club, so he would have shown there a lot. I do believe he did have a dealer in Providence, and at Brown and at RISD, he was well known too. So again, it is the sort of unfortunate story of somebody with, you know, great skill and intention and all the chops to back it up, ending up being sort of relegated to this regional profile.
And I'm curious about the Philadelphia Prize that you mentioned. Can you tell us a little bit about who else might have been in that show and some more about that at all?
Well, it was 76, and let me just look this up very quickly here. My understanding, and I'm just trying to verify this, was that, you know, he was certainly in an exhibition. It was the Philly World Expo, basically. So he was in an exhibition with other American painters, many of whom were sort of like the direct forebears of the Hudson River School, which in many ways were sort of in their dying breaths. And I think that the way that it's sort of framed and what I've read is that what Banister presented in this, you know, very kind of Barbizon influenced kind of workaday scene was something that represented a clear break from that kind of old vanguard, ultimately that old way of thinking that had become outdated and didn't really jive or represent, you know, the onrushing modernity that the country was facing. But I couldn't give you names, unfortunately.
Do you think in giving him that award that they were making a statement about his starting a sort of a more modern type of painting, that they were really making a statement about that and giving him the award?
You'd like to think so, wouldn't you? I mean, there's a little bit about the exhibition here that I'm just trying to scan through. I mean, 1876, I mean, just thinking historically, yeah, I mean, that was a period when, I mean, he was painting concurrently with somebody like Winslow Homer, for example, who was very popular and very well known, and somebody who sort of approached modernism in a different way, not like this, obviously. So I mean, I can't answer that definitively. I don't know what the judges would have been thinking, and I haven't read anywhere what their rationale was for choosing it. But yeah, I mean, it would make sense that if they were sort of a learned jury, they would understand what was coming from the other side of the ocean. And of course, at that time, I mean, all American painting and modern painting certainly flowed from France. So
Here's another question. How did he make a living?
he made a living as an artist. I mean, his wife was a successful hairdresser too, so that probably helped. They weren't wealthy people, but he was well enough known and well enough regarded in sort of the greater Rhode Island art community that he had patrons, and he was collected, and he was commissioned, and he did all right. He was not famous, obviously, he was not rich, but he was okay, and he was very well respected.
I would like to say thank you so much for coming.
Oh,
It's
thank
been
you.
fascinating to listen to you.
Oh, great. Well, I hope so.
I have two questions. First of all, who did he study with? That's question number one. And question number two is, when he came all the way from Canada, he must have known that he was leaving an area where he was safe physically
Hmm,
from slavery, entering another area where he could very well have been captured and sold into slavery.
good point. Yeah. Again, that there's so little sort of biographical information on him. I can't imagine what his thought process was. He came with his brother. Whether it was sort of an assumption, as you say, I mean, coming from a safe place to a place that was not safe, whether it was a simple matter of sort of youthful chutzpah, they wanted to go to the big city and make their fortune. I mean, that's what I've always assumed. And then became quickly embroiled with activist communities, and very sort of like taken up with abolitionism, and they really, that would have been invigorating. I'm assuming, again, I just putting words in his mouth at this point, but my expectation would be somebody who sort of is intellectually vibrant, and obviously as determined as him, would have been really taken up by the possibilities that presented. I mean, there wasn't a lot for somebody of his ambitions to do in a place like New Brunswick anymore. And to sort of, I'm just guessing, knowing what little I do of his character, that he would have been eager to embrace the fight, so to speak, and he did. He was a very serious activist. So, and who did he study with? I believe he's the model of the autodidact. I mean, he had a great education through high school in Canada. He studied arts. He lived with a wealthy family that had books upon books, and he was fundamentally self-taught, and then found his community once he came to Boston. He was already a very good illustrator, found a community of artists that he worked with, but I mean, he had no formal training.
So another question, did he or his brother leave descendants?
No, they had no children. He and his wife had no children. That I do know for absolute certain. So.
And how about his brother? Did his brother?
I don't know. I was not. The materials that I have don't describe what became of his brother. I don't know what path he took. I mean, I assume one of less renown than his brother. So.
Mhm. Okay. Other questions from the group? Now's your chance, folks. We've got. Oh, I see Barbara has a question. Barbara, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. I wonder if the thesis writer had a special relation to the artist, or had she discovered him? Is there a story behind her writing the dissertation?
That's a good question. And that I don't know. You know what? I spoke to her. I didn't ask her why she was drawn to him. I mean, she's a African American scholar herself, and had read. I can tell you some of her antecedents. I'm just scrolling into this. If you know who Romare Bearden and Harry Henderson are, a couple of very prominent African American artists and scholars of kind of the 40s, 50s, and 60s era. And Banister's always been, I think Banister's always been sort of this figure, particularly for Black artists and scholars, despite his sort of lack of proper fame. He's been a real kind of beacon, I think, of sort of determination and skill and deep thinking, and this real sort of emblematic figure of what's possible versus extraordinary odds. So there's always been an interest in him and his career and his work in those circles, and that's certainly where she comes from. But again, like I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't know more about him, and it's shocking to me that he's not better known, because there's absolutely no reason for it beyond sort of historic prejudice, in my opinion. So.
Okay, other questions? Now's your chance, folks. Looking around to see if anyone's got a hand raised. Is that Arlene? Do you have a question?
Laura or Murray, I'm not sure. But I think, are you talking about the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition in 1876 that he won the prize?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was an exhibition that was to commemorate the 100th anniversary of American independence.
Oh, not the World Expo, right?
Yeah, and I think that was the one that Thomas Aiken showed, the Gross Clinic, the famous, one about the
That
doctor.
was shown. That was, yeah, of course. No, I know the painting. I didn't realize it was shown there. Wow. But again, it's like interestingly sort of hyper real, heroic, sort of like extraordinary picture. But yeah.
Yeah, I think it was considered kind of distasteful to some people, and I think they showed it away from in a separate space. But I think
that's interesting. I mean, if maybe just to describe the Gross Clinic, I mean, it is literally a surgery being performed with the heroic doctor with his books overseeing it. So it's, I mean, it's interesting that it would have been seen as shocking. Yeah. But anyway, very famous work for sure.
Thank you, Arlene. Other questions? I'm looking around and seeing if anyone has their hand up, but people could just jump in with something. And not seeing. No, I think I don't see any other questions. Well, Murray, thank you so much. That was really, we have a lot to chew on. I think this is going to be.
Well, don't go away just yet. I do want to share. I do want to share the link to that thesis because I mean, I think that talking about Banister just leads you to want to know more about Banister, and this is, in many ways, this is the book on it. And Tracy's she's an excellent writer, so it's not as though it's difficult to get through either.
Great. Well, we'll enjoy getting that, and when that goes in the chat, people can cut and paste it from the chat to a document, or they can just click on it and then they will have it in their browser. So that's how you save something in the chat. But the other thing is I can send it to everyone as well if people miss it. And we have a thank you coming in, and I think we all thank you for the talk. And I'm seeing hands clapping, the silent Zoom clap, thumbs going up.
Too kind, too kind.
So thank you so much, Murray, and really appreciate you being with us today. And it's really, that was some deep stuff here. So I think we have a lot, as I said, I think we have a lot to chew on. And so for many of you, we'll see you next week on Wednesday, April 14th, for Carol Scolan's talking about American modernism in New England. So it kind of, there is a connection here, folks, a little bit. So that'll
next chapter, yes.
And other than that, we hope to see you soon in person or on Zoom. I hope everyone enjoyed their dinner from Blue. I'm seeing some thumbs up on that. So good. And so great to see you all. And so take care, and we hope to see you soon. So thanks again for coming.
Thanks everyone for coming. I hope it was useful for you.
Thank you, Murray. Thank you.
My
so
pleasure.
much.